Welcome, everyone. My name is Sanjay Sethi. I'm the co-executive director of Artistic Freedom Initiative, and I'm delighted to chair today's session, which has been organized in participation with University of Pennsylvania Cultural Heritage Center, and a special thanks to Brian Daniels and the PennCHC staff in helping to make this event possible. We are honored to be joined by an exceptional panel today, which will feature Milo Rao, the artistic director of the Vienna Festival, Goranka Horjan, the chair of ICOM's International Committee for Museum Management, and Kirsty McCourt, EU advisor for the Artistic Freedom Initiative. Before we begin, I want to encourage everyone to engage actively in the discussion. Please feel free to share your questions and comments in the chat as we go along. We'll dedicate about 10 minutes at the end for the Q&A, and this session is meant to be a collaborative dialogue, not only a space to exchange experiences and practical solutions, but also an opportunity to connect to people who are committed to strengthening cultural governance as a part of democratic resilience. I should also mention this session is being recorded, and we will make this recording session available afterwards. Before beginning, I'd also like to thank UNESCO Mondiacult and our partners, INTERCOM and Resistance Now, as well as all of you who have joined us for this important side event. Your collaboration and commitment make these conversations possible. At Artistic Freedom Initiative, to give you an idea of our organization, our mission begins with direct support to artists at risk, which means providing immigration representation, relocation assistance, and resettlement support. But we also recognize that protecting artists individually is not enough if the wider cultural environment in which they work is being dismantled. This is why we pair our casework with research and advocacy on artistic freedom, and why we have convened this conversation today. Over the past decade, our monitoring has shown a clear and troubling pattern. Governments are increasingly interfering in cultural life, not always through overt bans, but more through subtler, insidious mechanisms. We consistently see that governments deploy various mechanisms, consistently the withdrawal or politicization of arts funding, the purging and replacement of leadership at cultural institutions, the burdensome bureaucratic changes in cultural management, and even the weaponization of the courts and media against cultural actors. These measures are deeply alarming because they reveal a deliberate intent to curb pluralism and free expression in the cultural space. They reflect a rejection of democratic values and in many cases carry authoritarian undertones. We've documented these developments most vividly in Central and Eastern Europe. In Hungary, cultural institutions, for example, have been systematically brought under the control of party loyalists, with theaters, museums, and even film schools subordinated to nationalist ideology. In Poland, during the years of law and justice rule, public funding for the arts was tied to compliance with conservative cultural narratives, and blasphemy laws were deployed to silence critical or minority voices in the arts. And in Slovakia, similar moves have emerged with attacks on independent arts councils and efforts to channel resources away from projects deemed politically unaligned. Why are illiberal regimes so focused on museums and cultural centers? Because those are the places where societies tell their own stories. They are spaces where contested histories, minority voices, pluralistic perspectives come into view. For governments pursuing a populist agenda, whether it's right or left, built on exclusionary nationalism, such spaces are intolerable. Controlling cultural institutions means controlling the narrative of who belongs, what is remembered, and what visions of the future are legitimized. In Hungary, for example, museums have been pressured to recast migration as a civilizational threat. In Poland, under the last regime, history museums were pushed to present a singular, heroic national story that sidelined minorities' experiences. And what's more, there were other tools used, such as the blasphemy law, to have the same effect on arts and cultural workers. These interventions show how capturing culture is not ornamental, it is strategic. This trend is now present in the United States, where we see the efforts to commandeer cultural institutions such as the Kennedy Center and the Smithsonian Institution. When we speak about freedom of expression, the role of an independent press is widely acknowledged and defended. What we are arguing here, and particularly at AFI, is that cultural institutions deserve the same recognition. They are vital spaces where freedom of expression, diversity, and pluralism are not abstract values, but lived practices. If these institutions lose their autonomy, our societies lose not only their cultural richness, but sacrifice a core value of democratic life. This is why this dialogue today is so urgent. It's about surfacing the patterns of interference that too often go unnoticed. And it's about learning from the experiences of our panelists and participants and how we can build safeguards so that cultural institutions remain independent and artistic freedom continues to flourish as a part of our shared democratic resilience. And with that, I bring you to our first panelist, Milo Rao. Milo is the artistic director of the Vienna Festival. He is a renowned director and author who has published over 100 plays, films, and books. His theater productions have been shown at all major international festivals, including the Berlin Theater Treffen, the Festival d'Avignon, the Venice Biennale, and the Vienna Festival. And from 2018 to 2024, Milo was the artistic director of NT Ghent. Milo, as somebody who's worked on the ground in this space, what makes this issue so urgent now? And why is it essential to address cultural autonomy as a part of broader democratic resilience?
Hi. Thank you so much for having me here on that panel. I'm in Vienna now, and it's quite interesting when we look back on the elections of last year. We have a right-wing party. You described the situation of the nationalist change or the right-wing revolution in different Eastern European countries like Poland or Serbia or Slovakia and so on. And when there was the election last year for the Freedom Party, which is the right wing, the biggest party now in Austria, they had 2 points in the election program about art, and that was to kind of canceling all the funding for my festival and for the Eurovision Song Contest. And it was everything. And to go back to national values concerning the funding of the culture, like brass bands and so on. So nothing against brass bands, but you could ask why are they attacking the cultural sector so strongly? And I think one reason is very clear, is economical, because you can attack us because we depend from public funding. It's much more difficult to attack the art market. It's more difficult to do the bookmark, to attack the bookmark and so on. But the universities, the big theaters, the public art institutions, you can attack them. But just saying, okay, when we are elected, we will stop the woke, leftist, liberal, whatever culture, and we want to have a kind of, as you say, the praising of the cultural heritage, or a kind of a limitation on a very heroic history and on a big canon, and not an experimentation. And of course, it's very dangerous. On the one side, of course, it's the platform of open public discourse. So you could say that it's kind of an indicator. It's the first thing that dies is freedom of speech. When a democracy changes, or a liberal democracy changes into what they call a guided democracy or a managed democracy or a liberal democracy. Very funny word place, by the way, because illiberal democracy, what would that be actually? And you can feel that you go somewhere else. And I think it's quite important that at that very moment we defend the institutions. You know, I think we come out and perhaps as a more philosophical thought, we come out of a phase of discussion when we were trying to kind of deconstruct intellectually and from a point of the civic society, the big institutions, to question them, to ask, but is it good what is inside them? Now we are at the point to defend them, to have them still, because they are closed. And the initiative we started, and perhaps I can finish my first answer on your question. The initiative we started, Resistance Now, that you I think you named in the very beginning of the introduction, was triggered because I'm in Vienna, and in Bratislava we started it a year ago. Mate Dirlichka, I think he will be watching now this discussion. The general director of the National Theatre, he was dismissed, and what was kind of by the right wing government, or by the nationalist government, was just dismissed because his positions were too liberal. Actually, he's not such a liberal. I'm also not such an extreme liberal. I'm just like a kind of an art maker, somebody who tries to avoid the limitation of the space. But then nobody reacted. In whatever. I mean, we are 40 minutes by car from Bratislava. We have the same airport. But in Vienna, in Austria, in the German-speaking world, nobody reacted. A bit like what happens in Bratislava stays in Bratislava. So I was asking myself, but this is very dangerous because when we stay national, and here I come to the European, let's say, size of the whole network we try to construct, we have to act on a European level. We have to call the European Union to support artistic freedom of the different member states. And first of all, we have to link to our colleagues in Poland, in Sweden, in all countries in Europe. Now we were in New York. We have to link together as a civic society and as the artistic institution. So this is super important because this kind of national thinking is also inside our own thinking, especially in the theater sector. We are very nationalist, and this depends from the canon. It depends again from the funding logic that you are politically funded by the nation and not by the European Union, sometimes by the European Union, but normally not. So that we try to link and finally realize the European project on the level of artistic institution. I think that's something we didn't do enough in the last 30 years. So we come quite late, you know. And this is where we have to go quite fast concerning a legal framework, concerning a networking inside the different institutions, the different support, and so on.
Thank you for that. And I think you raised an interesting point on your political leanings or other people's political leanings. I think when we see this situation come up, if you have an independent cultural manager or a director of an institution that wants independence and autonomy, that doesn't mean that they have a specific political point of view. It means they want independence and autonomy and want merit and artistic merit to govern their practices or their cultural practices. But I think sometimes those actors get sucked into this vortex of right and left, and that dialogue and that binary approach can be very, very dangerous. But I think it was a very interesting point, and that actually will bring us to our second panelist, Goranka Horjan. Goranka is a renowned art historian who since 2000 has been managing several national museums in Croatia, currently being the Director General of the National Museum Castle Trakošćan. And as former Assistant Minister of Culture, she was a national representative at the DG Culture in the Council of Europe. Horjan was also the chair of the board of the trustees of the European Museum Forum. And since 2019, Horjan has been the president of INTERCOM, ICOM's International Committee for Museum Management. And starting with that, ICOMs are custodians for good practices in the management of cultural institutions such as museums. Horjan, from your perspective, what standards and practices are essential to safeguard independence and professional integrity in times of political interference?
Thank you. Yes, indeed, ICOM would like to be supportive to museums to stay independent. And I must say, as being more than 40 years in museums, I still remember the period of socialism that every museum had a party commissar who was regularly reporting what is happening in the museum to the Communist Party, whether we are on the right track, what we are to exhibit. Is the great leader well presented in our museum, etc. So we hope that such times are really deep in the past, but we are obviously witnessing now that new trends really wake up ghosts and the practices we would not like to see again. What we tried to make is that somehow professionalists unite in finding efficient tools to combat this political interference. Therefore, INTERCOM, together with CIMAM, started Museum Watch Governance Project with the help of external experts, Annika Schrame and Jan King, and we wanted to analyze those reported cases and see how we can be helpful for that. One of the her recommendation or something we could agree on is that perhaps not leaving people alone. So this may be the strength of professional organizations like ICOM to set up standards, to actually write some guidelines for professional conduct in order to ensure that museum directors will be not attacked one by one and fall as an obvious victim, how to say. But it's not easy to do that. Even before, for example, entering EU, many countries were, under surveillance to obey these democratic rules, etc., and where somehow the governments were frightened not to make a mistake, to be blamed in media or being undemocratic also. But nowadays we see that they really do not care anymore. And it is very difficult to gather forces and actually to put in place right procedures. One of the conclusions is, of course, that we have to provide a structure against arbitrary political interference by having formal documents like museum acts, bylaws, statutes, governance acts, etc. However, since we really, as INTERCOM, checked globally a lot of cases when there is a clear determination to interfere, nothing really stops politicians. Then regular reporting on how governance is done, having a clear procedure for appointment of key persons. This is also essential, at least in order to prevent that non-professionals and people who do not match basic requirements for museums are appointed on leadership positions. However, in some countries, we saw that when the government is shifting, then new directors are being appointed. This is also the case because for example, museum directors are the only persons without permanent contracts in the institutions. So all the other employees have permanent contracts, while museum directors depend directly on the governmental appointments, whether it is a ministry or municipality or region, and which makes them vulnerable in every way. And of course, our attempt was maybe to create a kind of a toolkit for executive boards or board of trustees that run museums that are above the directors. However, they are also appointed by the politics, and their own jobs depend on political appointments. So it is very hard to have independence when all the stakeholders in the line above and below actually depend on the decision making by politics.
Thank you for that, and thank you for detailing your efforts on implementing and the struggles on implementing best practices. And I guess as a human rights lawyer, I often wonder how those practices can be better informed by international human rights law and the protections therein for artistic freedom. And then on the other side, I know as an organization dedicated to this issue, it is a relatively new thing to even think about the independence of cultural institutions and the autonomy of cultural workers and artists within the framework of international human rights law, which takes us to our next speaker, because Kirsty McCourt is a human rights lawyer with over 18 years experience working with major civil society organizations and national human rights institutions. Kirsty currently works as a senior advocacy advisor for the Civil Liberties Union for Europe, and she's also the senior EU advisor for AFI. Prior to that, Kirsty has led advocacy programs at Human Rights Watch and the Open Society Justice Initiative. And from 2017 to 2020, she was the co-chair of the Human Rights and Democracy Network in Brussels. So, Kirsty, in thinking about this a little bit more, and especially with somebody of your background, much of the EU's work on safeguarding democracy is focused on media freedom, with concrete mechanisms for monitoring accountability and resilience. What lessons from the civic, rule of law, and media space can be transferred to the cultural sector, and how might similar frameworks help protect artistic freedom and ensure that cultural institutions are not left more vulnerable than the press?
Thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and I think I'll be able to draw on the previous speakers. So I think what we've seen, and my work has, as you said, has been very centered around kind of rule of law and civic space in the EU over the last decade. And in that sphere, we saw a kind of democratic backsliding, a systematic breakdown of the rule of law, but it evolved in some ways quite slowly and took place over a kind of 10 to 12 year period, particularly in Hungary and in Poland. And I think what we've seen now in the last couple of years is a much more alarming rate of decline and a kind of combination of different factors. And the trends that we're seeing in the rule of law, civic space area are the same trends that we're seeing in the artistic freedom sphere. And so we saw, for example, in Slovakia, how over really an 18-month period, the structures and the democratic decline, both in the arts sphere and in the civic space sphere, happened very, very quickly. And at a regional level then, and particularly looking at the EU, as an institution, the EU does in many ways have a very broad set of tools that have also evolved and developed over the last decade, but they were deployed in many ways quite slowly, without enough urgency, and without the real force that could have been used. And so the early warning signs weren't really caught, and it wasn't really possible to stem the problems and to kind of halt the backsliding at the very early stages. There were a number of cases. There was a case against the judiciary, against the actions taken to limit the independence of the judiciary in Hungary already in around 2012. But the case was decided on the grounds of age discrimination and not on the independence of the judiciary. So it was a real missed opportunity. One of the more recent tools that we've seen the EU develop over the last 6 years has been the annual rule of law reports, which now, over that period of time, start to show the trends. They are detailed reports, but again, we see a kind of disconnect between the recommendations and a lack of action. So a few things that we can learn and how we can use the space that already exists and some of the tools that exist. The annual rule of law reports have 4 chapters looking at the justice systems, at the media, at corruption, and a kind of catch-all chapter on the checks and balances. And one possibility would be to use that existing tool and expand the chapter on media to include media, academic, and artistic freedom. And to look at that then within the scope of the rule of law and really bring the monitoring that organizations are doing across the region into that sphere. If we look at the possibility to bring cases and litigate, particularly before the Luxembourg court, where the cases, they're not super rapid, but they are faster than the cases at the European Court of Human Rights. And importantly, the Luxembourg court has the ability to impose very, very significant sanctions in the realm of tens of thousands of euros a day, something that the Strasbourg court could only dream of. And we've seen a groundbreaking case, for example, also against Hungary on freedom of association. It didn't necessarily change things totally on the ground, but the jurisprudence is very significant, with the court for the first time recognizing the right to freedom of association. And very uniquely in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, there is a specific article on artistic and academic freedom, which doesn't exist in a lot of the other regional and international human rights treaties. But it's never really been tested or litigated. So that would be another sphere to look at. So I think in conclusion, as to kind of what exists already, there are tools. They have been used, but not with enough urgency. And, you know, as the other speakers pointed out, we need to look at dedicated tools. And I think I can come back to that as well in the next question.
Great, and thank you for that. I think as governments are getting creative, it would be nice to see in the coming years organizations such as Artistic Freedom Initiative and other organizations that are working in this space really start to test the legal ground at the EU level and start to get innovative in this space. Just a quick reminder to the participants, feel free to drop the questions that you have in the chat box, in the Q&A box. And we'd be happy to take those towards the end as we now get into the second round of questions, which is, what are the actions that are being taken right now? Where are we seeing the resistance? Where are we seeing the opportunities? And going back to Milo, as the artistic director of the Wiener Festwochen, you launched Resistance Now, as you had detailed before, as a call for transnational solidarity in the arts. In a moment when political interferences are escalating and cultural autonomy is under siege, these sorts of initiatives like Resistance Now foster solidarity across diverse artistic communities and institutions. And coming off of this, right now, how is the Resistance Now tour going? Who is your audience? And to even add a few more questions to that, how has it been received? And who is missing in these conversations that you feel could be added in?
I would say that the first year of the Resistance Now tour was focusing very much in Europe. I mean, we were first time in New York already, and in Taiwan, and in some other places, but mostly we tried to connect what is called Central or Western Europe and what was called in the past Eastern Europe. So to bring together these kind of different spaces, geopolitical spaces that in the minds of the Europeans are still divided. For example, a very strange thing is in the curation of my festival. I give you just this as an example. Vienna, which is, I would say, a Middle European capital, was mostly curated with plays from Western and Northern Europe. So it was more probable that you would go into my festival with an American play or a French play than a Croatian play or a Slovakian play, Hungarian play. So to kind of bring these two spaces together, this was the first attempt. And that's why we were linking a lot with, for example, the BITEF Festival, which is a festival in Serbia, the national festival in Serbia, who was almost closed and now is reopened, and we cooperate and co-produce very closely. So we try to bring together debates, but also cooperation work on the level. And the last thing is, and this is, I think it was in November that we started the Free Culture campaign. So we went from discussions, from speeches, from networking. We went to the level of the European Parliament and the European Commission, trying with this to change the framework of the cultural policy or the possibility to interfere by the European Commission and the European Parliament to the different member states. Because I don't know if you, I mean, you know that better than me, but I don't know if all the listeners know, but if you could say there is a taboo in the European politics, they interfere in many things, economically, for example, in the rule of law in the different member states. But what concerns the national cultural policy, there is a big independence, and I think it's a beautiful thing, of course, and it should be like this, and it's a part of the independence of the cultural scene. But it was, as we saw in the different speakers today, it was abused, so that there was a kind of there's a, you could say, a nationalist cultural policy in different member states. So we tried to start with this campaign a discussion, and in the end, a framework and even a new law that makes it possible to appeal to the European Commission, but also to interfere in the different member states. So this is what we are trying to do now, and I think there it was a kind of an explosion of the audience. So before we had a smaller cultural audience, and then for the first time we united 200 institutions, and we had 100 million. That was the ETC counting readers in 20 different countries. And from there, next step, we went to the Bratislava Declaration, and now we hope to present next May this first framework. When I was in Avignon, and of course there we come to the real politics. When I was in Avignon, I had a discussion with some people from the European Commission, and they said, of course, it's beautiful to have this law, but again, the question is how much will they be adopted by the member states, and what are the tools to kind of manage to when it is necessary to interfere. To come back to the case of Matej Direčka in the beginning, when you are dismissed as a cultural worker or an artistic director, this is a quite normal thing. When you have a new government, you are dismissed. So, I mean, I think on that framework, we have really to start to reflect on how do we put people in position, how are they taken away from positions? Because it's like what Goranka said. It's very true that if I know if a new government in Austria or Vienna will come, most probably, which will be right wing, most probably I will lose my job. And this is how it goes. And of course, it should not be like this, but we are kind of used to it. So we try to change all this. We try to connect. We try to break out of the cultural sector. I think one of the most important discussions I had in the beginning when we started to work on the legal framework on the European level, they said, don't talk about artistic freedom, because then it immediately becomes a kind of a side topic. Talk about the rule of law. You know, you should not be dismissed because you are liberal. When you're dismissed because you have a certain sexual orientation, or you are part of a certain religious community, of course you can go to Strasbourg. But if you are dismissed because you are liberal, what does it exactly mean? You know, what does this? So don't talk about art, don't talk about the rule of law. And I think that's what this is about. It's really about democracy in its core. It's about how we want to live, and it's not really about if we want a bit more or a bit less, let's say, a more conservative heritage in our theater houses. Because again, I think the main argument from this right-wing shift to dismiss directors is that they are too experimental, that they don't have an echo in the majority of the society who is not interested in it. But when you look on the programmation of even of my festival, of all the big theaters, the canon is very present. The tradition is extremely present. So the experimentation is, or what is called liberal or woke or whatever, is very small anyways. So we are talking about 5 to 10% of the programmation. And I think it's very important that we reflect on that. We don't have a leftist cultural politic at that moment. We still have a very, and I think it's fine, very traditional one. So even going backwards there is very dangerous. And it's very sad, because if we don't produce art today, if we don't experiment today, if we don't have the space to do it, what will then be the heritage of the future? What will it be, you know? So we can't do this mistake. And that's what we try to make people to understand. And the second thing that we try to make them understand is, of course, that it is about the basic values of how we want to live together. It's about the independence of the different institutions. It's about democracy. It's not about an art house. It's not about, it's not about the concrete programmation of a festival. It's even not about political beliefs or whatever. It's just about having an independent space, defending an independent space, and even constructing an independent space. Because democracy is not existing since ever. It's existing since 30 years in some countries in Europe, in others since 50 or 60 years, and already slowly the liberal democracy disappears. So we are talking about a very basic thing, and we are using art as a first big example.
No, I think that's really important. I think, in human rights, we always think about rights. I think thinking about this as civic space, and it's where the arts and cultural sector is so interesting compared to, for example, journalism. Galleries are civic spaces, concerts are civic spaces. How much the arts occupy civic space, and the idea with the liberalism is shrinking that space as much as possible, which makes the arts and cultural sector is such an interesting resistance point. I'm wondering just very briefly, because you've taken this tour in so many places, and there's obviously a solidarity building across the locations that you're going. Do you see any variations in terms of the tour? Have there been distinctions that have emerged from one location to another, or anything that stood out as maybe unique amongst your stops along the tour, or is it just kind of a lot of solidarity building, and a large group of people being alarmed by the same processes that are going on?
What I was impressed was that it's a global thing. You go to New York, you go to Sweden, you go to Taiwan, and you go to Slovakia, you go to Serbia. Wherever you go, you will find the same combination of cutting fundings, right-wing shift in the politics, bringing together a cultural fight, bringing together with a kind of an idea of a privatized sector, art sector, so closing the public space, and symbolically first in the arts. So this is everywhere. The second thing, what is quite interesting, I call it the Atlantic illusion, that you always think that the more you go to the West in Europe, and I was working for a long time in Belgium and in France, so in the very Western part, the more you think that this is an Eastern problem concerning Europe now. And the less you understand that it will be 5 years later. I remember when this happened in Slovakia, and it went very fast. The closing down and the dismissing of all the directors was I think you said 18 months, Goranka. So it was really fast. And I remember when I told him, you know what, looking on what happens here, I look in my own future as an Austrian. The Slovakians looked in their own future, looking to Hungary. Hungary looked in their own future, looking to Russia. So you have really a kind of a domino effect that goes fast, because these, let's say, the cultural politicians, the first thing they did when they had the majority, they invited Viktor Orban from Hungary. So they are copying even in the terms of the new cultural laws. They are copying the other countries that are already a bit further. So that's the thing. That's what I somehow found out. And if it's changing, I think yes. The need of resistance, the need of uniting, the need of having a legal framework, the need of finally investing in the European idea, in a kind of a transnational idea, transnational law. I think everybody started to understand this need in the last 5 years.
Great,
in
thank
my
you.
sector.
And moving to the museum space, Goranka, I wanted to query you on the challenges for museums. And challenges for museums have changed over time. As discussed, a new set of challenges have emerged, namely ethical governance and political interference in cultural management. How are you adjusting to these challenges in your work with INTERCOM? I know you went into this a little bit already, but if diving maybe a little bit deeper into Code of Ethics and Museum Governance Watch Project, if you can detail that a little bit.
Yes, of course. We saw an opportunity with the new revision of ICOM Code of Ethics, which is in progress, as an opportunity to somehow add these paragraphs on governance issues, which were really, really outlined in basics in the previous document. Since governance is actually the backbone of the institution, it affects everything the museum does. So if you don't pay attention to this part, you will suffer consequences in all other aspects of work. And that is what we have pointed out. We also try to work hard that this code of ethics actually enters museum acts in every possible country where we can advocate this, so that through the legal system we somehow force national governments to obey the international codes. This also has to do something with what also Milo mentioned, that the argument of the autocratic regimes is often that art and culture address minorities. They do not correspond with broad community. This make us think how we can reach our communities on a larger scale. Because I always say, hey guys, those people were elected by somebody. And these people are around us. So probably their frustration or dissatisfaction with some economical issues are manifested in that way. So this accountability to public is really important for museums, and I think museums are crucial here because we are the places that little kids visit right from the start with schools, and you should have a stronger educational component in your work. And of course, community advisory bodies, if they enter our structure, could be a helpful tool against political interference. When you mobilize the people around you, if you have participatory governance models in a way, when you are inclusive, then you give less arguments for acting in the interest of the majority. And this leads to another component, which is a professional autonomy of staff. Clear protection of museum directors, curators, researchers, to make decisions, to do their work without the fear of dismissal or reprisal. Employment protections should be implemented for all. Of course, the more people are vulnerable, it will be more likely to have auto-censorship as well. So not only that somebody tells you not to do this or that or explore this and that topic, but of course people feel insecure themselves and are more likely to make compromises or avoid difficult subjects. We had lately, for example, really strong attacks on our ministry because they have financed some festivals which right-wing supporters didn't like. So how this can be financed from the national budget, you know, that it doesn't reflect the majority's opinion, etc. So the media and the television were reporting on how this open dialogue should be really on all the time, and that people can protest or can confront, but they have to solve issues in an ethical way. For the institutions, it is of course very important to have independent boards, structuring governments in a way that, for example, the boards of trustees or executive boards, depending in what country, how they are called, should include diverse representation. If these people consist only on, for example, from our colleagues who are depending on the proposed political decisions. So, but if you have people who are independent of that power on the board, of course, they can express their opinion more clearly without the fear of being reprised or not appointed when their elections are in question. And so actually all museum activities, it is for us vital, should be fulfilled in an ethical, effective, transparent, accountable, and equitable way, and based upon the principles that are shared by all the constituents in the museums, but also, how to say, always have our audience in front of us. And, connecting with people is crucial here. When you get the public support, this is important. And I would like also to say another thing. INTERCOM is doing training projects lately. For example, we put a lot of emphasis on reputation and trust. So this is crucial for institutions like museums that are still trusted, unlike media, because it is sometimes media can be helpful, but even in a divided or polarized society, you immediately have media with an etiquette. Oh, if this media is reporting on this, they are belonging to this party. If they are reporting like this, they belong to the opponents. So I think museums are really good places to promote democratic values.
Thank you for that, Goranka. And then moving from good governance to the law, Milo had referenced this earlier, and a couple of organizations on this call, including Artistic Freedom Initiative and Resistance Now, are part of a larger group helping to draft and act on artistic freedom in the EU, which is similar to the Media Freedom Act, which had recently has come about. So as a legal expert and EU advisor to AFI, you've been closely involved in advancing proposals to strengthen the European framework for artistic freedom. And from the Bratislava Declaration to the idea of the EU Artistic Freedom Act, what concrete steps can the EU take to enhance protections for artists and ensure accountability when governments interfere in cultural life? And if you can explain the value of the proposed measures, my apologies. Maybe have like 5 minutes to answer that question as we move to the Q&A. Do your best, of course. I know this is a tough one to end on.
Thanks very much. So a lot has already been said, and as Milo mentioned, a lot of different groups came together in Bratislava in May. There you can even see, I think, briefly on the screen. And recognizing the crisis that threatens artistic freedom and calling, therefore, for an EU instrument with a structured approach to address artistic freedom. Goranka already mentioned quite a number of the structural issues that need to be addressed, and that, I think, is what we would see as important. And for arts and civic space organizations to take the lead in developing something that is forward-looking and can try to address the threats when they're still at an early stage by building in those structural elements and not waiting actually until we need to take a case before the courts and things have progressed to a very serious level. As Sanjay mentioned, there is some inspiration that can be drawn from the recently developed European Media Freedom Act, which was also born out of the repression of free media and the tragic killing of two journalists in Slovakia and in Malta. And as Milo was saying, that there is this reflex to say, well, the cultural sphere is member state competence. Everybody has the independence to kind of govern and organize their cultural spheres. But there's also the possibility at EU level under Article 114 of the Treaty of the European Union for the EU to adopt measures that support the functioning of the internal market. And that's where we would see that where the arts sectors are threatened in one country, that impacts on other member states. It impacts on the ability of cultural workers to move from one member state to the other. It impacts on the ability of a theatre to set up in a different member state. It impacts that kind of free flow of movement, of people, of capital, of workers. And as we've all stressed, it undermines the articles that the EU is founded on, the articles under Article 2, the values of rule of law, human rights, etc. So the idea is to develop what could be called a European Artistic Freedom Act. It would look at kind of the rights and the duties of artists and cultural institutions, as well as those who are the recipients, if you like, of cultural expression. And, you know, it would look at a number of different areas, the safeguards that need to be put in place for the independent functioning of culture and institutions, as has been mentioned several times, appointments procedures, due process around dismissal. So looking at all of those structural elements that can be put in place to, as much as possible, prevent the kind of dismantling of the sectors that we've seen happen, for example, so quickly in Slovakia. As well as a kind of cooperation element, and there could be something like an observatory that monitors the state of artistic freedom, but also that shares best practice and promotes cooperation, and a kind of final part around protection, that when the individuals and organizations are under attack, there is somewhere where they can seek protection. So the Bratislava was kind of one point in this journey. There are, as Sanjay mentioned, groups that are working to try and kind of flesh this out, see what it would really look like, identify where the gaps are, and there will be lots of possibilities over the coming period for consultation and ideas and inputs, so that we can aim to develop something as strong as possible that responds to the needs of the sector.
Thank you, Kirsty. And I wanted to thank everybody for leaving the questions and comments in the Q&A, and you can keep them coming. There's not so much time left, but our team is managing the chat, and we'll be happy to share the resources with the participants after the webinar. And just to start with one question and leave it open for the panel. The question from Ricardo is, how can we as European arts community be more vocal together and get more attention from the mainstream media? And I know, you know, for our organization, when we first reported on Hungary in 2022, this was a little bit more difficult to get attention. I think this issue is more on the radar now, but it also sometimes comes secondary to journalism or the judiciary. I mean, liberalism moves on many fronts, but how do you think we can get more attention on this issue? And how have you experienced this in your practices?
If I perhaps can add to this or answer to this question, we just lost a trial some days ago, actually, against a right-wing politician, very known here through the Ibiza affair, from the former, he was former vice chancellor of Austria, and we published the speeches we had during the Resistance Now campaign, and one sentence in the speeches was not 100% correct concerning him. So he started a trial against us. It's called SLAP trials or SLAP lawsuits. You will know them. So which are made to kind of silence different journalists by proving that they made a middle mistake, for example, in research against right-wing attempts against democracy and so on. So when this trial came in against my publishing house and now against my festival and against myself and against the public institution that was where I was holding this speech, which is a federal German institution. So in the first moment, I was ashamed and a bit shocked, and then I remember that I met one member from your association, and I met other professionals about it, and they told me, but there are 10,000s of trials like this, and it's a structural campaign to silence people, to silence journalists, to silence activists, and to silence artistic institutions. And when I understood this, we decided to speak out, to make this trial big, to make the discussion big, to make a press conference, to, I don't know, then we had articles from The Guardian to Die Zeit and to everywhere, just because we decided to make it public, to understand that this is happening to many, many people, because we can do it as an institution. I am still quite safe as being the artistic director of this big festival, you know, while when you are a journalist or you are an artist that is completely independent, of course you are not. And I think we should use our power as institutions and as associations, and having a knowledge about the structural nature of what is happening. We should use this power and we should speak out. And the interesting thing is, or the interesting fact is, let's say public media is super interested in it. They are really, when we can show that the nature of it, they are super interested in. So we should use this power.
Thank you for that, Milo. We don't have too much time. I'm going to take a short one, unless Kirsty or Goranka, you had an addition to. Okay. So one question was, how important to your response is understanding what motivates your opposition movements as they target arts and cultural institutions? And I may even start with that a little bit, because we've written these 3 reports on Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, and we're currently in the middle of a report on this broader phenomenon of interference in cultural institutions globally. I think it's vital, because I think one thing that we've seen in the last 20 years, we've seen populist rhetoric for a long time, and it's been proven to be an effective electoral strategy for a long time as well. But oftentimes, populist regimes have come in and they haven't necessarily changed or deviated too far from the political left-right dichotomy in their countries. And in the US, it's been an effective strategy from both parties before. But I think with liberalism is we've seen a deeper program to actually put a framework of governance based on the populist rhetoric, more so in the last 10, 15 years. And for me, that's what's distinguished this modern illiberalism, is that it has come with a particular style of governance and particular targets. And, you know, amongst my friends and colleagues, you know, working in the past in the arts, many of them say, well, you know, how much does this exhibition matter or that exhibition matter in the grand scheme of things? And it's really interesting, because in some ways it took these governments to start shutting these things down and shutting forms of art down to get people to really care about the arts in a way that maybe they took for granted before. And that motivating impulse for many of these illiberal governments comes from, in our work, in our research, addressing historical wrongs. And it's not just a rhetorical strategy on the campaign. It has come to fruition in their governance, because they want to use media, they want to use cultural institution to address these wrongs. Understanding what the historical wrongs are that they want to address will inform the way that you resist these policies and the actions that need to be taken. So I think it's vital. I'm happy to hear from the other panelists as well on how important it is to understand the motivation of the opposition, and it can vary from country to country. And I'll add one more thing. I mean, in addressing historical wrongs, that Hungary passed a new constitution in 2010, and it put a narrative on the historical founding of the country. And that should have indicated to people that they're putting a historical narrative that is of questionable historical accuracy in their constitution. So off of that, over 15 years, came this cultural policy. I'm wondering if there are other examples in any of your works on what motivates these governments.
For me, for example, it is really interesting and see how in museums we can react on that. Actually, it is good to understand the processes in the society, to try to understand why something happens and how these things are actually fueling this populism, and how people adhere to this. Because it's obvious that a set of rules, all these democratic principles that have been deeply rooted into all the policies on European level somehow dissolve suddenly in reality. Media are also maybe not always helpful, even if they are opponents, but they are just fueling the oil into the fire, mainly being concentrated on the conflict itself, confronting key stakeholders instead of maybe putting forward the values and advocate what we as a society should do to benefit from our societal environment. I think this is crucial. This component of well-being and social welfare for everybody is somehow missing in the dialogue.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think we've gone over time. These are great questions, and I think maybe what we'll try to do is save these questions and think about how we can answer them or make them a part of future programming, or maybe even inform future programming. I'm really looking forward to continuing this discussion in other fora. We're all getting really deeply involved in this issue right now, and I know there are a lot of organizations in solidarity with ours, and we're really looking forward to continuing connecting and continuing to discuss these issues in public fora in the future. And I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank the panelists. Thanks to PennCHC. Thanks, Mondiacult. I hope you enjoy your day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are.